Get out of my son's house." Those were the first words Harlow Beckett heard when she walked through the front door of the Whitmore estate. Not hello, not welcome. Just that, flat, cold, final, the way you'd speak to a dog that had wandered onto your porch. She didn't flinch. She never did. 3 hours later, the man who had said those words would be sitting on the floor of his own dining room, unable to stand, unable to speak, unable to understand how the woman he'd just tried to destroy had brought his entire world down without raising her voice once. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. 2 hours before any of that, the evening still looked salvageable. The Whitmore property sat at the end of a private road in Westchester County, 12,000 square feet of restored colonial architecture, a hedge maze nobody used, and a view of the Hudson that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a year. The occasion was the Whitmore Family Foundation's annual dinner, 40 years running, 120 guests in black tie, white orchids everywhere, a string quartet that cost more per hour than the catering staff earned per week. Waiters in pressed jackets carried trays of champagne that no one finished. Harlow arrived alone, driving herself in a 10-year-old Volvo that the valet took without expression but held at arm's length, like something that might contaminate the Bentleys. She wore a navy dress she'd bought at Nordstrom Rack 2 winters ago. Sensible heels, no jewelry except a thin gold band on her left hand. Her hair was pulled back simply, the way she wore it in court, neat, unobtrusive, precise. She carried a small handbag that had seen better decades. At the front entrance, a young man in a waiter's uniform was struggling with a stuck service door, his tray balanced in one arm, his face tight with quiet panic. Harlow stopped. She set down her bag, used both hands to help him wedge the door open, then steadied the tray while he recovered. "Thank you," he breathed. "I've been fighting that thing for 10 minutes. Bottom hinge," she said. "Lift as you push." She smiled at him. "You've got it now." He looked at her like she'd handed him something he hadn't expected to receive. She picked up her bag and went inside. That was Harlow Beckett. She had spent her life noticing the things other people decided weren't worth their time. The stuck doors, the tired waiters, the people standing in rooms like they didn't belong there. She noticed because she had been all of those things once, very far from here, very long ago. Her husband, Elliot Beckett, was already inside, somewhere near the bar, probably trying to talk his father off whatever ledge the old man had climbed onto this time. Elliot had married Harlow 3 years ago in a small ceremony attended by 14 people. He hadn't told his family until it was done. He knew them well enough to know that was the only way it would happen at all. His father, Sterling Whitmore, had never forgiven either of them for that. Sterling was 71, silver-haired, and possessed of the specific certainty that belongs only to men who have never in their lives been told no by anyone they respected. He had built Whitmore Capital over 40 years. He gave to museums, to senators, to foundations that bore his name in marble. He sat on 3 hospital boards and 1 federal advisory committee. He believed in merit the way other people believe in God, loudly, selectively, and in ways that always seemed to confirm he already had it. He had formed his opinion of Harlow the day Elliot brought her to Sunday dinner 8 months after the wedding. She'd arrived in that same navy dress, or one very like it. She'd shaken Sterling's hand without deference. She'd answered his questions about her work in short sentences. She hadn't laughed at his jokes. She hadn't asked about the foundation. She hadn't acted impressed by the house. Sterling had decided in the first 20 minutes that she was a fraud, a woman who had seen an opening and taken it. His son, kind to a fault, brilliant in the wrong ways, had been taken in by someone unremarkable, someone without a name worth knowing, someone who would cost them eventually. He had been waiting 3 years for the cost. Tonight, he decided, was close enough. Harlow was standing near the window with a glass of water. She didn't drink at events like this, hadn't in years, when Sterling crossed the room toward her with the deliberate stride of a man who had rehearsed this. "I want a word," he said, loud enough, just loud enough. A few heads turned. Harlow turned to face him. "Of course, Sterling, Mr. Whitmore," he said. A pause. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore." He let that land, then continued. "You've been in this family 3 years. 3 years, and I still don't know a single thing about you that Elliot hasn't told me himself. You have no background I can verify, no family here tonight, no one who will stand and vouch for you in a room like this." He tilted his glass toward the crowd. In 40 years of these dinners, every person in this room has a story I know, except you. I'm a private person, Harlow said. Private. He repeated it like she'd said something amusing. That's a polite word for it. People nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. Elliot appeared at Harlow's side, his jaw tight. Dad, not tonight. Don't. Sterling raised one hand. This has been 3 years coming, Elliot. You made a decision without this family, and we have all been paying for it. He turned back to Harlow. I had someone look into you. Harlow's expression didn't change. You hired an investigator. I did. Thorough one. And what he found was interesting. Not because there was anything there, but because there was almost nothing. No family money, no property, a law degree from a state school, a modest practice in a city no one here has reason to visit. You married my son, and I still cannot figure out what exactly you bring to this family. She brings herself, Elliot said. That's what she brings. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters. Sterling ignored him. He was looking at Harlow the way he looked at grant proposals he was about to reject, with the patient contempt of a man who has already made up his mind, and is simply going through the motions of due diligence. Let me say what I actually think, Sterling said, and the nearby conversations dropped to nothing. I think you saw my son, good, trusting, too generous for his own interests, and you calculated. I think you decided this was a door worth opening, and you opened it. And I think you've been managing your image in this family ever since, showing up in that dress, a glance down at her clothes, flat and dismissive, driving that car, playing modest, playing humble, because you understood that demanding things would show your hand. She hasn't asked us for a single thing, Elliot said, his voice shaking now. Not yet. The word landed like something dropped from a height. Harlow was quiet for a moment. Then, you think I married your son for money? I think, Sterling said, that people without money usually have reasons for marrying people who have it. That's not an accusation, Harlow said. That's a prejudice dressed in a suit. Sterling's eyes narrowed. And your investigator, she continued, wasn't very thorough. He's the best in this city. Then he billed you for effort he didn't put in. She said it without heat, the way you'd correct a filing error. But that's a conversation for another evening. There won't be another evening. Sterling straightened. I want to be very clear. I want this said in this room, with these people present. You are not a Whitmore. You will never be a Whitmore. Whatever Elliot has put in your name, whatever access he's given you, I will spend whatever I have to spend in whatever courtroom I have to enter to unwind it. You have been a project, and projects end. A waiter was standing 3 feet away, completely still, staring at his tray. Elliot's voice came out stripped of everything but cold fury. Say one more word to her. I dare you, or what? Sterling looked at his son with something close to sorrow. You'll choose her over your family? Over 40 years of everything I built? Over your name? Elliot didn't hesitate. Yes. The room went very still. Without a second thought, Elliot said. I have chosen her every day since I met her, and I will keep choosing her after you've run out of things to threaten me with. Sterling looked at his son for a long moment. Then he turned and spoke to the room, the 120 guests in their black tie, all of whom were now watching openly. This is what happens, he said, almost philosophical, when you raise a son to be kind instead of smart. When you teach a boy that goodness is the same as strength, he ends up giving everything away to someone who knows how to ask for it quietly. He shook his head. I'm not angry at her, I'm almost impressed. I'm angry at the weakness that let this happen. Elliot started forward his arm. Don't, she said quietly. Her voice was steady, her face was calm, but something had shifted behind her eyes. Not anger, not hurt, something older than both of those. The particular exhaustion of a person who has done this before. Not this room, not this family, but this moment. The moment when someone decides you are the sum of where you came from and refuses to look any further. She had been in rooms like this her whole adult life. She had been underestimated in all of them. She had learned a long time ago that you don't correct people's assumptions by arguing with them. You wait. You let them speak. You let them build the case against you in front of witnesses. And then you let the room see what they built. Sterling, she said. He turned back, faintly surprised she was still speaking. There's someone coming tonight who asked to meet with you about the Whitmore Foundation's infrastructure grant, the one you've been trying to close for 8 months. She paused. I know because he told me. He called last week. She let that sit. His name is Theodore Marsh. A few things happened at once. The Foundation's executive director, a careful woman named Patricia who had been hovering near the bar for the last 10 minutes with the expression of someone watching a car accident in slow motion, went absolutely still. Two of the men closest to Sterling turned to look at each other, and Sterling himself, just for a fraction of a second, looked uncertain. "Theodore Marsh," he repeated. "He said he's been trying to reach you for 3 weeks. Something about the terms on the Caldwell infrastructure project." Harlow's voice was even. "He mentioned he might stop by tonight. He had something he wanted to show you in person." "Why would Theodore Marsh contact you?" Sterling said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "He didn't contact me," she said. "He contacted my father." The sound of a car door. It was faint, barely audible through the tall windows, through the music and the conversation, but in the sudden near-silence of the room it carried. Footsteps on the gravel drive. Sterling looked toward the windows, then back at Harlow, then toward the door. He had no idea what he was about to see. He was still building the story, still deciding whether this was a bluff, whether she had somehow engineered something, whether there was still a way to reclaim the ground he'd given up. The front doors opened. A man stepped in from the night. He was in his late 60s, unhurried, wearing a plain wool overcoat with no decoration, no cufflinks visible, nothing to mark him. His hair was white, cut short. His face was the face of someone who had long ago stopped needing anyone's approval and found the experience restful. He moved through the entrance the way water finds its level, without effort, without performance, finding the center of the room because that was simply where he was going. His eyes swept the space once. They found Harlow, and his face, until that moment entirely composed, went soft in the specific way that belongs only to fathers. He crossed the room. Sterling was tracking him the whole time, trying to place him, running through 40 years of faces and deals and handshakes. He had almost gotten there when his foundation director, Patricia, appeared at his elbow and said in a voice stripped entirely of its professional composure, "Sterling, that's Owen Beckett." The name hit the room like a change in air pressure. Sterling turned to Patricia. "What? Owen Beckett." Her voice was very careful. "He founded Beckett Infrastructure Group, the firm that designed the Caldwell project, the one that holds the primary contract on the infrastructure grant you've been negotiating." She swallowed. "He's been on the other side of that table for 8 months. You've been trying to get his signature." Sterling's face did something complicated. "That's his daughter," Patricia said. Owen Beckett reached Harlow and put his hand on her shoulder. One hand easy and familiar, and she let out a slow breath. "Everything all right?" he said quietly. "It's fine, Dad." He turned to look at Sterling Whitmore for the first time. Sterling's mouth opened. Nothing came out. It was Patricia who filled the silence, unable to help herself. "Mr. Beckett, I had no idea you'd be joining us tonight. If we'd known, we would have—" "You weren't meant to know," Owen said, not unkindly. "I had an interest in seeing this family on an ordinary evening." He paused. "This has been informative." He didn't say it with heat. That was the thing. He said it the way you'd observe that the weather had turned. Factual, almost mild, containing something enormous underneath the surface. Sterling found his voice. "There's been a misunderstanding." "Has there? What was said tonight?" "It was a family matter. Private. I heard most of it from the driveway." Owen's voice was still measured. The windows were open. His eyes moved across the room, slowly, taking in the people, the phones that had appeared, the 120 guests now arranged in a loose circle around all of them. "You told this room that my daughter had nothing, that she had calculated her way into your family, that she wasn't worth knowing." He paused. "In front of witnesses." Sterling's hand found the back of a chair. "You've been trying to close the Caldwell contract for 8 months, Owen continued. $260 million in foundation funding. That contract runs through my firm." He reached into his coat pocket and produced his phone with the calm of a man who had thought this through long before he arrived. "I've been patient with the timeline because Harlow asked me to be. She didn't tell you who I was because she wanted to see what kind of people you were when you thought it didn't matter." He looked at Sterling with something that was not quite pity but was adjacent to it. "You showed her." Sterling's knees went. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a collapse. Not exactly. More like a slow withdrawal of something structural. He sat down into the chair behind him. Heavily, a man whose body had simply decided it was done, holding the weight of the evening. His hand gripped the armrest. His face was the gray of old ash. The room was completely silent. One of the guests near the fireplace, a woman who had laughed quietly at something Sterling had said 40 minutes ago, the laughter of someone who wants to be on the right side, set down her glass and looked at her shoes. Owen dialed a number. He didn't move away. He stood in the center of the room, in plain sight, and put the phone to his ear. "It's Owen," he said when someone answered. "The Whitmore Foundation account. I need you to send them a formal notice of contract termination review first thing tomorrow." "Yes." A pause. "I'll explain the full situation when I'm back. Tonight's been clarifying." He hung up. Sterling made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "The contract," he started, "is under review," Owen said. "Whether it moves forward will depend on a number of things. None of them," he added, "involve how much money your family has." The moment that followed was the kind that people would remember for years, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't, because of the image. Sterling Whitmore in his $1,000 jacket, sitting in his own chair in his own house, surrounded by his own guests, looking like a man who had just understood the dimensions of what he'd done. He had spent the evening trying to reduce a woman to her most convenient version. He had performed that reduction in front of 120 people, not because he had evidence, but because he had always been allowed to, because no one had ever cost him anything for it. The cost had walked in through his front door in a wool overcoat. Elliot was across the room in 4 steps. He pulled Harlow into him, his forehead against her hair, and she let him hold her, her hand flat against his back. "I'm sorry," he said into her hair, "for all of it, for years of it. You chose me," she said. "Every time, that's all." Owen watched them. For a moment, the hard, careful look he'd worn since he walked in softened entirely. He put a hand on Elliot's shoulder. "You told your father you'd choose her," Owen said, "when you thought you'd lose everything for it." He looked at Elliot steadily. "I don't forget things like that." Sterling watched the 3 of them from his chair. His wife, Constance, who had stood nearby through the entire exchange with the frozen expression of someone watching the walls come in, reached for his arm. He didn't seem to feel it. He had spent 40 years building a name that meant something. He had handed that name to his son, and his son had used it to defend a woman Sterling had decided wasn't worthy of it. He looked at Harlow, at the navy dress, the sensible heels, the thin gold band, and tried to find the calculation he'd been so certain was there. He couldn't find it. He could only find a woman who had stood in his house for 3 years, steady and quiet, never once asking him for anything, and his own voice on the recording that someone in this room had definitely already sent somewhere. "I'd like to speak to you privately," Sterling said. His voice was almost unrecognizable. The authority had gone out of it. What was left sounded tired and old. "Tonight isn't the night for that," Owen said. "I understand, but if we could, the contract, the foundation." "We'll find a time," Owen said, not warmly, not coldly, the way you schedule a difficult appointment. "Tonight, I'm taking my daughter and her husband to dinner." Sterling didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue with. The 3 of them walked toward the doors, the cold night air spilling in as they opened. 120 guests watched them go without a word. The footage had left the house before the doors closed behind them. By morning, it was everywhere. The video was raw and close and real. 5 or 6 different angles, stitched together by someone who had stayed up to do it, with nothing added, no score, no captions needed. Just Sterling Whitmore saying she married my son for money, and Owen Beckett saying I heard it all from the driveway and the chair, and the face and the silence. It had 4 million views by the time the morning papers loaded. The coverage came in 2 waves. First, the social feeds, fast and unsparing, the clips, the quote cards, the threads breaking down exactly who Owen Beckett was, the infrastructure firm, the Caldwell Project, the $260 million that had been 3 signatures away from the Whitmore Foundation's ledger. Then, slower and more thorough, the business press, the analysis pieces, the ones that traced back 8 months of negotiations and pointed out that Sterling had been in the room with Owen Beckett's name on every document and had never once connected it to his daughter-in-law, because he had never bothered to learn anything about her that she hadn't volunteered. He didn't know who she was, one headline said, because he never thought it was worth finding out. Whitmore Capital's board met that afternoon. 4 hours. The kind of meeting that doesn't end with a press release. Sterling left the building through a side entrance. An interim management structure was announced by close of business. 3 foundation partners put their commitments on hold pending review. The gala's charity auction had raised less than half its goal. Most of the room had gotten very interested in leaving not long after Owen Beckett walked back out. The legal piece came separately, and it was quiet but precise. Harlow didn't file anything spectacular. She was a lawyer. She knew exactly which part of the evening had names in a statute. A formal demand letter went to Sterling Whitmore's attorney on a Tuesday, citing the public statements the investigator hired to surveil a family member without consent, the specific language used in front of documented witnesses. It was 4 pages, single-spaced, airtight. Sterling's attorney called back within the week. There was a settlement. The terms were sealed. The apology was not. It ran on the foundation's letterhead, signed by Sterling Whitmore personally, acknowledging that statements made at the annual dinner had been inaccurate, unfair, and harmful, and expressing regret for the manner in which a family member had been treated in a public setting over a period of years. He had put that in writing. Constance Whitmore made her own private apology at a dinner 3 months later. Just the 4 of them, an uncomfortable evening that Elliot arranged, and Harlow agreed to attend because she believed, cautiously and without certainty, that some people could decide to be different. Constance cried once. Harlow handed her a napkin and asked about her sister's health in Maine. Constance looked at her across the table and seemed, for the first time, to actually see her. It wasn't reconciliation, exactly. It was the beginning of the long, imperfect work of it. Owen declined to discuss the matter publicly. When a reporter caught him outside his office and asked whether the contract with the Whitmore Foundation had been restored, he stopped walking. He looked into the camera the way he had looked at a room full of people who had thought he was no one in particular. "I don't do business with people," he said, "who think my daughter is a category instead of a person. That's not a position. That's just sense." Then he got into his car and the footage of those 2 sentences ran on a loop for the better part of a week. The Whitmore Foundation survived. Foundations usually do, but it emerged smaller, chastened, with a new governance structure and a board that asked questions it had never bothered to ask before. About its culture, about who sat at its tables, about what it had made acceptable quietly, over 40 years of dinners exactly like the one it could no longer hold without someone bringing up the footage. The cost of changing had a name, and the name was Sterling's. Somewhere in the house in Westchester, with the foundation files boxed and the board calls forwarded to someone else's number, Sterling Whitmore sat in the room he'd always used as a study and watched, for what he later told Constance was the 43rd time, the video of Owen Beckett standing in the middle of his ballroom. He had been wrong about many things. He understood that now with the specific terrible clarity that comes when the version of yourself you'd been protecting turns out to be the worst thing in the room. He had been wrong about Harlow, not in the careful way, not in the I misjudged some details way. Wrong in the way that mattered. He had looked at a person, his son's wife, a woman who had treated the valet with more courtesy than Sterling had shown anyone in a decade, and decided she was less than what she was because she didn't perform wealth the way he recognized it, because she hadn't tried to impress him, because her dress didn't signal the right things. He had been handed a daughter-in-law with a mind sharper than anyone he'd put in a boardroom, the patience of someone who'd learned long ago that people reveal themselves if you give them room, and the specific kind of dignity that doesn't require an audience. And he had spent 3 years trying to get rid of her. That was the part that stayed with him. Not the contract, not the board, not the apology on foundation letterhead. The part that stayed was the image of Harlow Beckett at the entrance to his estate, helping a young waiter with a stuck door, lifting a tray so a stranger could catch his breath. She had done that before anyone knew who she was. That was the whole measure of her. He had missed it completely. 6 months later, Harlow was back in court. Not for anything connected to that night. She had a docket that had never stopped moving, cases that needed her attention long before Sterling Whitmore decided she was worth an opinion. She was in federal court in Lower Manhattan on a Tuesday morning, in a suit that fit precisely and shoes that had logged several thousand miles of courthouse corridors, arguing a contract dispute that would affect a land development project in 3 states. She argued it the way she argued everything, without theater, without performance, with the kind of precision that comes from knowing your material completely and trusting that the work is enough. The judge ruled in her client's favor. She collected her files, exchanged a word with opposing counsel, professional, brief, without animosity, and walked out through the marble corridor into the November morning. Elliot was waiting on the steps. He handed her a coffee. She took it. They stood there for a moment in the cold, looking out at the street. "Your father called?" she said. "I know. He wants to come to the holiday dinner." Elliot was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about most things. "I want to see if he means it," she said finally. "I'm not going to pretend 3 years didn't happen, but I'm also not interested in holding the verdict over his head indefinitely." She took a sip of the coffee. "I think people can decide to be better. I think it costs them something real to do it. I want to see what it costs him." Elliot nodded. "And if he comes," she added, "he sits at the table like everyone else. No speeches, no announcements, just dinner. That's more than he deserves." "Maybe." She looked at him sideways. "But it's what I want." They walked down the steps together into the city. She was the same woman who had driven a 10-year-old Volvo to a black-tie dinner and caught a waiter's tray without thinking. The money had always been there, behind everything, the way it is when you've grown up, knowing it exists without needing to carry it in front of you. It had never been the point. It had never been what she was. Elliot had always known that. It was the first thing he'd loved about her. The world had simply taken a little longer to figure it out. Here's what I keep thinking about. Everything you just heard is fiction. Harlow, Sterling, the Westchester estate, all of it. None of those people exist. But that moment, when someone decides who you are before you've spoken a word, before they've asked a single question, just from the price of your shoes or the age of your car, or the fact that you came from somewhere they don't recognize, that's not fiction. That happens in offices and dinner parties and boardrooms and family gatherings every single day. It happens to people who don't have a contract on the table, who don't have an Owen Beckett on his way up the driveway, who just have to swallow it and go home and figure out how to go back the next day. Most of the time, there's no footage. Most of the time, the room doesn't go silent. Most of the time, the person being treated like Harlow just has to be the bigger person in private, without an audience, without a resolution, without any of it coming back around. That's the harder version, and most of the people I hear from have lived that version. So the question I want to leave you with is this: not what you would do if you were Harlow, but what you would do if you were standing in that room. Before anyone knew who Owen Beckett was. Before the doors opened, when it was just a woman in a plain dress being told she was nothing. Would you have said something? Looked away? Stayed quiet and told yourself it wasn't your place? Be honest. I think honesty is the only interesting answer. Drop it in the comments. I read them more than you'd think. If this story hit something real for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're not subscribed to Velvet Reckoning yet, now's a good time. There are more stories like this one. The quiet ones who turn out to hold all the cards. They always do.